You're here. Lovely. Let's talk about filth. Victorian filth. Modern people. You're so soft. Sniff your socks after 2 days, and suddenly it's a national crisis. In the 1800s, the average person was basically stewing in their own secretions, and somehow still thought they were the pinnacle of civilization. No deodorant, no flush toilets, not for most, and the soap, that stuff could strip paint off a battleship. They bathed in it, sometimes, maybe. But you've got options. Hot showers, lavender-scented body wash, and 15 different brands of antiperspirant that all claim to smell like confidence. Congratulations, you've already outclassed 19th century royalty. Now get comfortable. Seriously. Dim the lights, wrap yourself in that soft blanket you don't deserve. Maybe prop up a pillow or two. You're about to be lulled to sleep by the crusty, grimy details of a time when people thought wiping with newspaper was a sign of progress. If you're listening from the 21st century, congratulations, you smell better than 98% of human history. Subscribe, and if you're tuning in from another time period, let us know in the comments. We're always curious what century insomnia hits hardest. Now, if all goes well, you'll be fast asleep by the time I start describing how families shared the same filthy bathwater, starting with the father and ending with the toddler. If not, well, that's on you. Sleep well, or don't. Either way, let's begin. Let's start by setting the scene, and by scene, I mean the unsanitary hellscape that was a typical Victorian street. You imagine cobblestone roads, horse-drawn carriages, men in top hats tipping politely to parasol-wielding ladies. Charming, quaint, sanitized. No. What you're forgetting, conveniently I might add, is that those horses, they dropped around 50 pounds of dung per day, each. Multiply that by a city full of them. Add in the coal smoke from factories, chimney soot, and the occasional leaking cesspool, and what you've got is less romantic fog and more industrial-grade nose assault. People didn't just walk through filth, they lived in it, bathed in it, sold fish on top of it. And the smell? It wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. A charming note from a Victorian-era journal describes the familiar city aroma as something akin to burnt oil, wet fur, and boiled cabbage. Another called it the smell of London life. That's not an insult, that's a compliment, a civic fragrance. Now, let's not be unfair. The Victorians weren't sitting in puddles of sewage for fun. They simply hadn't connected the dots yet. Germ theory hadn't really caught on, so most people didn't think filth made them sick. They thought it made them tough. A little soot in the lungs builds character. Bit of mold on the bread, well, waste not. It was believed that bad smells or miasmas were what made you ill, not bacteria. So yes, they were aware the air was awful. They just thought masking the stench was the solution. That's why instead of cleaning up the waste, they'd just throw a handful of lime or lavender on top and call it a day. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. And here's where things get fascinating, or infuriating, depending on how many history books you've read. Hygiene in the Victorian era wasn't just about being clean. It was about being seen as clean. Cleanliness was a social cue. It told others that you were respectable, civilized, worthy of attention. But it didn't mean you were actually clean. Because for the upper classes, the greatest fear wasn't infection. It was association with the poor. If you smelled a little off, if your clothes were dingy, if your nails had visible grime, you risked being mistaken for someone who worked for a living. Horrifying. And so, the wealthy developed all kinds of rituals to distance themselves from the working masses. A well-groomed moustache, a lace collar, a spritz of perfume, all part of the Victorian deodorant starter pack. But full-body hygiene, a weekly sponge bath at best, maybe a full tub if you were feeling particularly revolutionary. And of course, servants did the dirty work, irony not included. Meanwhile, the working class who actually needed good hygiene because they lived in crowded, disease-prone neighborhoods were too busy hauling water, dodging waste carts, and sharing one bar of harsh soap between 6 people to worry about lavender sachets. But again, no one questioned this. That was the system. Cleanliness wasn't functional, it was performative, and if you could fake it well enough, society applauded. You modern people complain about having to take a 10-minute shower before a date. Imagine if smelling clean was a sign of economic power, and not smelling like coal smoke and boiled onion soup meant you were likely rich. That's what we're dealing with here. Of course, by the mid-1800s, cities started to grow faster than their plumbing. With more people came more waste. Sewers overflowed, drinking water became suspect, and people started dropping like flies from cholera. Yet somehow society still clung to the belief that a proper collar and dab of rosewater could outrun typhoid. There's something beautifully stubborn about that. So to recap, in early Victorian England, filth was part of the background. Dirt on the hem of your skirt, a badge of honor, it meant you'd been out and about. Smudged cheeks, a sign you were charmingly rustic. Blackened fingernails, perfect for a poet. A modern person, you would not have survived. You'd faint by breakfast. And don't chuckle, I mean that literally. The streets were so thick with animal manure, coal soot, and leaked sewage that people routinely slipped on it, broke ankles in it, drowned in it, occasionally. And if you're thinking, well, surely they cleaned their homes, oh sweet, naive listener, they swept the dirt from one corner to another and called it tidying. Spring cleaning meant beating your rugs until you coughed up soot, not disinfecting your countertops with lemon-scented wipes. Even Queen Victoria herself, who championed cleanliness later in life, spent her youth in palaces that hadn't seen plumbing since the Romans left. So yes, dirt was not just tolerated, it was decorative, a symbol of movement, of life, of industry. And if you dared to question it, well, you were probably French. Now, if you're still awake, and why would you be? Take a moment to appreciate your vacuum cleaner, your filtered air, your soap that doesn't double as oven cleaner. You live in a golden age of not smelling like a trash fire. That alone should help you sleep tonight. Next up, we'll talk about bathing, or the charming Victorian tendency to almost bathe, while still managing to make the water boil with shared shame. But for now, close your eyes, drift off, and be grateful you didn't have to live with horse droppings wedged into your boot heel. You're welcome. Let's clear something up right now. Yes, Victorians bathed, eventually, occasionally, when cornered. But before you imagine a clawfoot tub filled with rose petals and steam like something out of a period drama, stop it. That was rare, and usually lethal. The reality was much sadder. Most people, even the relatively well-off, weren't soaking in anything deeper than a chipped porcelain basin with lukewarm water and low expectations. Mornings began, if you were virtuous, with the sacred ritual of splashing your face and hands from a pitcher into a wash basin. That's it. No shampoo, no exfoliating scrub, just a quick slap of cold water to the cheeks, and a prayer that no one noticed the rest of you hadn't seen moisture since Easter. This little splash routine was called a toilette. Sounds fancy, doesn't it? That's how they got away with it. Add a French word and suddenly it's elegant, not lazy. Now, for actual bathing, you know, full body soap and water cleansing. Most Victorians did it once a week. Maybe, if nothing exploded, if there wasn't a plague, if the coal hadn't run out, if you were rich and bored. Otherwise, the popular method was what I lovingly call the strategic sponge attack. A little bowl of water, a worn-out sponge, a body. You dab the hot spots, armpits, groin, maybe behind the ears if you were feeling glamorous. That was your bath. A full body cleanse was a special occasion. Birthdays, holidays, or funerals, preferably someone else's. Now, if you had slightly more means, you might own something called a hip tub. Don't get excited. It's not a hot tub. It's not even particularly hip. It was basically a metal bucket shaped like a recliner that you sat in up to your waist while silently regretting your life choices. To fill it, servants or you, if you were unfortunate enough to be your own servant, would have to haul boiling water from the kitchen to the bedroom, bucket by bucket. A process so tedious, so backbreaking and so inefficient it was often easier to just smell bad. And once the tub was filled, oh, you thought you got to use it alone. That's adorable. No, in most households water was a precious resource, so baths were shared. Yes, shared. The family bath was a weekly event, not unlike a baptism, but with less religion and more skin flakes. The father bathed first, naturally, then the mother, then the older kids, then the younger ones. By the time it got to little Timmy, the water was closer to stew, and I don't mean that metaphorically. The bathwater wasn't drained and refilled. Oh no, it stayed, it marinated, it matured. And yes, there were actual instructions in Victorian household manuals for how to keep the water fresh between bathers, usually involving more soap, more hot water, or just lying to yourself. Congratulations, Timmy, you're bathing in Daddy's legacy. Now, for the truly unfortunate, and that was most of the population, indoor bathing wasn't even an option. No tub, no plumbing, not even a proper wash basin. You used what you had, a wooden bucket, a cold stream, or nothing at all. But there was one shining beacon for the water-deprived, the public bathhouse. Public baths were where the working class went to clean themselves in bulk. Rows of metal tubs, buckets of tepid water, and the comforting presence of other underwashed humans. Think of it as a gym locker room meets Dickensian despair. Theoretically, it was a place of hygiene. In practice, it was a place of lice, of murky water, of borrowed towels and mysterious foot fungus. Still, it was better than nothing, which is precisely what most people had at home. Some of the bathhouses even allowed you to do laundry while you soaked. 2 birds, 1 bucket, cleanish body, cleanish shirt, 1 vat of grey water, efficiency at its finest. You may be wondering, why didn't they just bathe more often? They had water, didn't they? Yes, but not hot water, not piped water, not the kind of water that comes out when you twist a tap. Every drop had to be carried, heated, and rationed like it was treasure. And depending on where you lived, water could be contaminated, scarce, or both. Plus, no one really thought daily bathing was necessary or good for you. That's right, too much washing was considered suspicious, wasteful, even dangerous. Some doctors warned it could weaken the constitution, or heaven forbid, stir the passions. So they kept it simple. Cold water, sponge, elbow grease, hope. Now compare that to your life. You've got bath bombs, rainfall shower heads, a shelf full of products that promise to exfoliate, moisturize, hydrate, and glow. You have water pressure. You have towels that aren't made of burlap. And still, you complain when the water's a little too cold for 2 seconds. Victorian people would have traded a child for your loofah. So next time you grumble about your shower taking too long to warm up, remember this: if you'd lived in 1853, your weekly bath would involve hauling 4 buckets up a narrow staircase, sharing your water with 5 relatives, and scrubbing yourself with soap that could remove barnacles. So, you've filled your tub with precious water. You've braved the cold. You've resigned yourself to sharing that liquid disappointment with the entire family. Now comes the moment you reach for the soap and realize it's made of boiled animal fat and caustic chemicals. Ah, the Victorian luxury experience. Soap technically did exist, but don't let that comfort you. The stuff you're imagining, soft, foamy, lavender-scented bars with exfoliating jojoba pearls, was not what Victorians had. No, what they had could double as paint thinner, or possibly a biological weapon. Let's start with the homemade kind. You'd take whatever animal fat was lying around, pig, cow, anything freshly rendered and preferably rancid, and combine it with a generous helping of lye. Lye, if you're unfamiliar, is a corrosive alkali, made by filtering water through wood ash. It's the same thing used to dissolve clogged drains today. Add heat, stir vigorously, pray you don't go blind. Once that mixture hardened, congratulations, you had soap. Sort of. A brick of harsh, smelly, skin-stripping sludge that left you feeling less clean and more chemically peeled. This wasn't gentle soap. It didn't soothe. It scoured. It scraped off dirt, yes, but also your top 3 layers of skin, most of your dignity, and occasionally your fingerprints. It didn't smell fresh. It smelled like disappointment and smoked ham, and it was precious. Not everyone had the time or ingredients to make it. Not everyone could afford to buy it, which meant for a lot of people, actual soap was used sparingly, almost like medicine. You didn't just lather it up and let it run down the drain. You rationed it. You sliced it into thin wafers. You whispered apologies to it before using it. The wealthy, of course, had better options: imported French soaps, scented varieties with rose, jasmine, or sandalwood oils. These were luxuries. A small bar could cost what a laborer earned in days. But that wasn't the point. The point was to look, feel, and smell superior. If your soap smelled like herbs and your neighbors smelled like bacon fat and smoke, well, everyone knew who had the better bath. Cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was about class. And just when things couldn't get worse, enter carbolic acid. By the mid to late Victorian period, a new miracle compound arrived on the scene: carbolic acid, a disinfectant derived from coal tar. It was powerful, it was scientific, and it made people feel like they were finally winning the fight against germs, even though germ theory wasn't entirely trusted yet. So of course, someone put it in soap. Carbolic soap became the go-to for hospitals, military barracks, and over-eager Victorians who wanted to obliterate bacteria and possibly their own epidermis in the process. It worked. It really did kill germs. It also stung like betrayal. And the smell, somewhere between antiseptic and engine grease. But people used it proudly, repeatedly, often on open wounds, because this was the era where being clean meant being disciplined, even if it hurt. And that was the core philosophy of Victorian hygiene. Cleanliness wasn't supposed to feel good. It wasn't about comfort or pleasure. It was about moral fortitude. If your soap didn't make your skin crack and your eyes water, you weren't scrubbing hard enough. So yes, soap existed. But the good stuff was expensive. The cheap stuff was borderline abusive. And most of it would have been banned by today's dermatologists within 5 seconds. And yet they still used it, rarely, carefully, as if trying not to anger it. Now, as you rest there in your soft bed, probably within 3 feet of 3 different kinds of soap, one moisturizing, one exfoliating, one shaped like a cactus for some reason. Just remember how lucky you are. No animal fat, no lye burns, no carbolic nightmares, just foamy bliss and infinite hot water. You live in the golden age of cleanliness. Now roll over, settle in, and try not to dream about scrubbing your armpits with pig grease. We're just getting started. Let's talk about body odor. Yes, that kind. Because in the Victorian era, everyone had it, and everyone pretended they didn't. There were no deodorants, no roll-ons, no sprays, no calming eucalyptus-scented armpit balm that promises 72-hour protection and smells like an expensive tree spa. Victorians had musk, personal, pungent, unavoidable. And when I say unavoidable, I mean that in the most literal sense. You didn't avoid the smell, you worked around it, you lived with it, you suffered through it. And sometimes, if you were very rich and very oblivious, you smothered it under so much perfume that your sweat actually fought back. Let's start with that. Perfume, the go-to solution for the reek of human effort. Both men and women wore it, not just a dab on the wrist either. We're talking full saturation, cologne applied like armor, floral oils dabbed behind the ears, inside gloves, under corsets, on the linens, in the wig powder, and sometimes directly on the scalp. The goal wasn't to smell pleasant, it was to smell powerful, overwhelming, to mask not just your odor, but your humanity. You weren't trying to fool anyone into thinking you'd bathed. You were trying to distract them long enough that they forgot you hadn't. Of course, perfume wasn't cheap. Good scent meant good breeding, or at least good income. That meant working class folks had to get creative. Enters homemade scented powders. These weren't your modern talcum-based, dermatologist-tested, hypoallergenic blends. These were rough mixes of baking soda, dried herbs, and whatever crumbled, vaguely floral thing was growing in your neighbor's yard. Lavender, if you were lucky, weeds, if you weren't. The powders were patted directly into the armpits, across the chest, sometimes even in the shoes. Anything to soak up the damp despair leaking out of your pores. And if that didn't work, you just hoped no one noticed. Then came layers. Oh yes, Victorians layered like onions. Not for warmth, but for hygiene. Sort of. See, they understood something important. You're going to sweat. But instead of washing more often, they built clothing to catch the sweat before it could hit the outer garments, like a filtration system made of cotton and shame. Enter the camise, a soft underdress worn by women, closest to the skin, and the undershirt or vest for men. These pieces served as the sacrificial layer. They absorbed the sweat, the oils, the grime, and crucially, they could be washed. Unlike outerwear, because here's the dark truth. Those glamorous coats, corsets, waistcoats, bustles, and high-collared dresses, they were almost never cleaned. Washing them was risky. Fabrics were delicate, dyes unstable, shapes easily ruined. So instead of washing, they were brushed, gently, occasionally, sometimes with breadcrumbs. No, I'm not kidding. Stale bread was rubbed over fabric to clean it. Welcome to fashion science, 1872. So, while the undershirt might go into a boiling pot once a week, your favorite frock coat, untouched, your finest silk gown, haven't seen water since the tailor finished hemming it. Now imagine that, layer after layer, sealed in on a hot summer day. No breeze, no air conditioning, just wool, corsets, starch, and fear. And the worst part, it wasn't the smell. It was the judgment. See, if you smelled bad, and they all did, that wasn't necessarily the issue. What mattered was how you smelled. A faint scent of lavender and goat probably just came from a respectable farm. But sweat, raw, industrial, you risked being mistaken for the lower classes, and that in polite society was social death. Because if the soap didn't prove your worth, and your perfume didn't distract them, and your underlayers didn't protect your cravat, then heaven help you, someone might think you worked for a living. The stench wasn't the worst part, the snobbery was. And make no mistake, it was an elaborate social ballet. The rich could afford more perfume, more undergarments, more powdered sleeves. The poor just hoped the wind blew the right direction. So they walked the streets, all of them marinating in a delicate mixture of coal smoke, sweat, and rosewater. A society held together by buttons, repression, and denial. Now, as you lie there in your clean sheets, surrounded by freshness, deodorants, detergent, and the comforting hum of modern plumbing, take a deep breath. Inhale. No horse, no bildew, no crushed lilacs trying to suffocate an armpit, just cleanliness. Undeserved, but appreciated. Sleep easy. At least you're not brushing your coat with breadcrumbs before church. Now, you might be thinking, sure, they didn't bathe much, and they wore 17 layers of unwashed clothing, but surely they washed their underwear, right? Oh, sweet summer child. They tried, but let me tell you something that should keep you wide awake out of sheer empathy. Laundry day was an act of war. Not metaphorically, I mean that literally. Victorian laundry wasn't chores. It was trench combat with soap. The process began with boiling water, which sounds fine until you remember this wasn't a faucet situation. There was no dial to twist. You had to light a fire, fetch the water by hand, from a pump or well, carry it back in buckets and heat it in massive soot-covered cauldrons that made your kitchen look like something from Macbeth. And what were you boiling? Undergarments, mostly. Chemises, drawers, undershirts, the sacrificial textiles, because, as we've established, outer garments didn't get washed. They were too precious, too elaborate, too doomed to survive soap. But your bloomers, straight into the cauldron they went. Of course, boiling was just the beginning. Once sufficiently scalded, clothes were hand-scrubbed by force on a washboard. This charming little device was made of ridged metal and hatred. You'd drag fabric across it until your knuckles bled and the fibers wept. Detergent? No, that would be far too kind. Soap shortages meant people turned to delightful alternatives like ashes, soda crystals, or, and I wish I were joking, urine. Yes, human urine, a surprisingly common household item, especially for stain removal. So the next time you spill red wine and reach for bleach, take a moment to thank the gods of chemistry that you weren't born in 1843 with nothing but a pot and a bladder. And even if you had real soap, it wasn't gentle. It was often the same caustic brick we discussed earlier. Animal fat and lye, great at breaking down grime, also great at breaking down skin. After the soap and scrubbing came the rinsing, which meant dragging heavy, waterlogged fabric into another tub filled once again by hand. And then came the wringing. You haven't known pain until you've wrung a Victorian bedsheet. They used massive wooden rollers called a mangle to press water out of the fabric. Picture two enormous barrels squeezed together with a crank, and you feed your clothes through it like pasta dough. If your fingers get caught, well, you'd be clean, but also possibly short a knuckle. Of course, this all took hours. Not metaphorically, I mean sunrise to sundown. And it didn't happen once a week, maybe twice a month if you were lucky. You didn't wash everything. You washed what you had to, because washing was exhausting. Drying? Even worse. Clothes were hung out on lines, no matter the weather. Rain, wind, smoke from the factory next door. Too bad. If you were rural, you had to watch out for animal droppings. If you were urban, you had to hope no soot-ridden chimney decided to exhale while your drawers were on display. And drying indoors, in tiny tenement rooms with no ventilation and 20 other people living in the same building. Good luck. Mold was more loyal than your soap supply. Even once clean, clothes didn't stay clean. You walked outside. You picked up dust, manure, coal smoke, and bacteria the moment you stepped out the door. That shirt you just scrubbed for 45 minutes, back to gently used by lunchtime. But still, they kept at it, because clothing was durable, not comfortable, not breathable, just thick. Thick wool, heavy cotton, stiff linen, designed not to make you feel good, but to last as long as your patience. You didn't wear clothes out. You wore them down, patches upon patches, hems restitched, buttons mismatched. A family coat might pass from father to son to grandson, each generation adding a little more wear, a little more sweat, and a little less hope. And don't forget, this wasn't just women's work. Oh no, it was servants' work, laundresses, washerwomen, entire classes of people whose lives were spent elbow deep in your filthy knickers, for pennies, often losing years of life to scalds, exposure, or inhaling lye fumes. Romantic, isn't it? So next time you dump your clothes in a machine, push a button, and go binge something on Netflix while your socks get massaged with lemon-scented bubbles, spare a thought for the Victorian laundress. Her version of delicates involved boiling underpants in a soot-caked pot and scraping them with something that looked like a cheese grater from hell. And you complain because you have to fold a fitted sheet. Now close your eyes. Rest. Know that your underwear will never be boiled in your kitchen, not unless something has gone terribly wrong. And now my personal favorite, Victorian hair care, also known as just pretend it's clean. Let's begin with the harsh truth. Victorian people did not wash their hair often, not because they didn't want to, though frankly, some didn't. But because they couldn't, water was limited, soap was harsh, and shampoo, as you know it, didn't exist. For the wealthy, hair washing might occur once a week, usually on bath day, assuming the household could afford the water, the help, and the heating. That was the luxury schedule. For everyone else, hair washing was seasonal. Yes, seasonal, as in spring, summer, fall, and winter. Pick one. You might wash your hair when the weather changed, or before a major event, or when you were trying to impress someone who still had a sense of smell. Otherwise, you coped. So how did they cope? Well, the same way we all do when we don't want to wash our hair. They lied to themselves. Enter the earliest forms of dry shampoo, Victorian edition, cornstarch, baking soda, powdered chalk, anything white and absorbent that could be rubbed into the scalp to soak up oil and shame. The goal wasn't to be clean. The goal was to look less greasy than your neighbor. And of course, they powdered their hair the same way they powdered their armpits, liberally, frequently, and with full commitment to denial. You might walk around with a fine mist of flour on your scalp, hoping no one noticed you'd skipped an actual rinse since Michaelmas. Now, this would be bad enough if everyone had their own personal hairbrush and comb. But oh no, in many homes, especially among the working class, brushes and combs were communal, shared, like teacups or towels. One brush to rule them all, passed from sibling to sibling, parent to child, even guest to host, which meant, naturally, that lice were also shared, faster than gossip, more reliable than postage. A family that combs together, infests together, and once lice were in the household, they stayed. Lice didn't care about class. They thrived in powdered wigs, in fancy hats, in curling hairpieces, and pinned-up buns. And Victorian hairstyles were the perfect breeding ground, tall, elaborate, full of teasing and twisting, and never fully taken down. Yes, many women, especially those with long hair, didn't let it hang loose every day. They pinned it up every morning, hair twisted into buns, braids, coils, curls. Sometimes they didn't unpin it for days, which meant dirt, dust, sweat, and whatever nature gifted you just stayed locked in. You didn't rinse your scalp, you fluffed it and hoped. Now, if you were a lady of means, you might have a lady's maid to comb your hair out for you every night. 20 to 30 strokes, minimum, not to clean it, to redistribute the oils. Natural shine, they called it. If you were poor, you had your sister do it, or your grandmother, or you didn't do it at all, and just scraped it into a tighter bun until the weight of your sins held it in place. And yes, there were products. Hair oils, tonics, pomades. Most of them were made from delightful ingredients like beef marrow, castor oil, and coal tar. Nothing says elegance like lard and kerosene massaged into the scalp. Men weren't any better. Victorian gentlemen used pomades made of bear fat and scented waxes to slick their hair into submission. The result? A shiny, sticky helmet of hair that could repel water, dust, and probably social interaction. And they didn't even pretend it was clean. They just polished the top layer and hoped no one asked too many questions. So what you had across society was a sea of humans with hair that hadn't touched water in weeks, maybe months, styled into elaborate structures, powdered with cornstarch, slicked with animal fat, and brushed with a communal comb last cleaned in the Crimean War. Now lie back and picture it. A quiet Victorian home, the fire crackling, the father brushing his hair with the same comb the toddler chewed on earlier, everyone politely ignoring the scratching sounds, the dog scratching in solidarity. This was not a world of bad hair days. This was a world of ongoing hair emergencies, managed by sheer stubbornness and the strategic use of ribbons. But they didn't complain. They didn't know better. They thought shiny meant healthy. They thought powder meant prestige. They thought lice were just part of life. So tonight, when you shampoo with something made of honey, avocado and unicorn whispers, give thanks. Your comb is yours, your shower is hot, and you, my friend, Do not have to boil your bonnet just to survive Tuesday. Sleep well. May your dreams be itch-free. Now let's drag ourselves down to the part of the body the Victorians considered optional. The mouth. Teeth. You have them. You brush them. You probably floss once a week and then lie about it to your dentist. But in the 1800s, hygiene stopped at the neck. Your teeth were basically a ticking clock, counting down to pain, poverty, and premature extraction. Yes, toothbrushes existed. Technically, if you were wealthy, you might own one. Just one, made with a bone or wood handle and natural bristles, usually boar hair, because what says oral care better than scrubbing your incisors with a wild pig? They weren't changed often. Why would they be? Waste not, want not. You used that toothbrush for months, sometimes years, or passed it down to a younger sibling like a cursed heirloom, and if you didn't own one, no problem. You just used your finger. Yes, a finger, or a rag, or a chewed stick if you were feeling creative. Apply whatever gritty, terrifying substance you had on hand and scrub until the bleeding stopped or your dignity gave out. Let's talk about that gritty substance. Toothpaste, if you can call it that. There were no sleek tubes promising minty freshness. There was powder, homemade and highly abrasive. Common ingredients included crushed chalk, charcoal, burnt bread, ash, salt, and sometimes, for extra zest, brick dust. Yes, ground up brick. Because nothing polishes enamel like sandblasting it with construction debris. Some even used tobacco ash. Because if the chewing didn't kill your teeth, surely the scrubbing would. And they did this, not out of joy or ritual. They did it because the alternative was toothache. And in the Victorian era, a toothache wasn't a nuisance. It was a sentence. The pain might last weeks. There were no numbing gels, no root canals, no ibuprofen. You waited, you suffered, you maybe prayed, and eventually you had that tooth ripped out. Dentistry was not a cozy little office with relaxing music and a bowl of complimentary floss. It was more like a punishment, handed down by someone with rusty pliers and a weak grasp of anatomy. There were dentists, of course, but many people, especially in rural areas, relied on barbers, blacksmiths, or the neighborhood tooth puller, whose qualifications included strong arms, a lack of empathy, and perhaps a bottle of gin to share before the procedure. Anesthetic, rare. The most common methods of pain management included alcohol, screaming, and passing out. That's it. That's the list. And it wasn't just one tooth. By middle age, it was normal to be missing several, if not most of your teeth. Gums receded, molars crumbled, and infection spread. If you were very lucky and very rich, you might afford false teeth. And let me clarify. I do not mean sleek, modern dentures. I mean wood, ivory, or, disturbingly often, other people's teeth. Yes, human teeth. Pulled from corpses or the very poor and fitted into a horrifying simulation of a smile. There's a reason the phrase wooden teeth keeps popping up in old records. It wasn't a joke, it was a warning. Victorians didn't floss, not because they were rebellious, because floss didn't exist. The closest thing would have been twine or a sharpened stick, and most people just didn't bother. If food got stuck, it stayed. You'd chew around it, you'd swallow it later, or you'd just give up chewing altogether. And this, dear listener, was considered normal. So as you lie there freshly brushed, breath minty, gums intact, consider how charmed your life is. Your toothbrush probably has a tongue scraper. It vibrates. It lives in a sanitized charging dock with a name like Sonic Clean or Dental Force. Meanwhile, your Victorian counterpart just gargled salt, spat into a coal bucket, and prayed their molars wouldn't explode mid-breakfast. So no, they didn't floss, they didn't rinse, they didn't visit an orthodontist, they just suffered, like adults. And somehow, the world kept turning. Now close your mouth, clench your jaw, and try not to dream about brick dust on your tongue. You're doing great. we've arrived at the part of history everyone pretends didn't happen. Victorian bathroom habits, or more accurately, the complete lack of them. Modern folks love to complain about a slow flush or a dodgy public toilet. How quaint. Try living in a world where your toilet was a bowl you kept under your bed. No plumbing, no privacy. Just a ceramic pot of shame and the fading hope you wouldn't knock it over in the dark. Yes, the chamber pot. Your best friend and worst enemy, tucked discreetly beneath your bed, waiting patiently for the moment nature called and dignity declined. If you had a bit of class or at least a strong stomach, you'd use it, cover it and carry it out in the morning to dump in a designated location. If you didn't, well, you might just toss the contents out the window. That wasn't urban legend, it was urban reality. A quick shout of Gardy-loo, a warning to the poor souls below, and down it went, sometimes into the street, sometimes onto an unsuspecting hat, sometimes into a neighbor's open window. Public sanitation wasn't a concept, it was a hope. If you were in a city, your options didn't improve much. Most urban dwellers didn't have private bathrooms. They had communal privies, 1 to 2 outhouses shared by an entire tenement block. You might wait in line. You might carry your own paper. You might not come back the same. These weren't tidy garden sheds either. These were flies and fungus palaces, where multiple families shared one wooden seat, and no one quite knew whose turn it was to clean the pit beneath. And if you lived in the country, congratulations, you got to dig your own hole, or aim at a bush, or, if you were especially unfortunate, rely on the family outhouse with the wasp nest in the roof and the door that never closed properly. But let's say you were fancy, rich, forward-thinking, you had an indoor toilet. Well done. Enjoy your early flush toilet, which in its original form didn't actually go anywhere. Yes, early indoor toilets often emptied into a brick cesspit directly beneath the house. Picture that, a pool of human waste under the floorboards, in the summer, in London. The smell, biblical. The danger, even worse. These pits leaked, overflowed, and festered. Methane gas could build up, sometimes causing explosions. That's right, in the Victorian era, your bathroom might literally blow up, and if the cesspit didn't overflow, the sewage often found its way to the nearest river. In London, that meant the Thames, and for decades the Thames carried the entire city's excrement on its slow brown journey through the heart of the capital. Which brings us to 1858, the Great Stink. Yes, it was called that officially, capital letters, because when the hot summer arrived and the sun baked the river, the stench of untreated sewage became so overwhelming that it brought the government to its knees, literally. Members of Parliament stuffed their noses with lime-soaked handkerchiefs just to stay conscious inside the chambers. The stench wafted through the city, through windows, through bedrooms, through churches. No one escaped. And what did they do? What any reasonable society would do. They tried to cover it up. Buckets of lime were dumped along the banks. Curtains were hung. Perfume was sprayed. But sewage doesn't care about your potpourri. The smell remained. It festered. It bullied its way into every orifice of Victorian life. Eventually, London rebuilt its entire sewer system, not because of moral outrage, not because of disease, but because the government physically couldn't stand the smell anymore. And this, all of this, is why the Victorians were so obsessed with manners, with politeness, with appearances, because the minute you stepped outside, you were surrounded by human waste in every form imaginable, and the only thing standing between you and despair was a hat and good posture. So next time you flush a toilet and hear that satisfying swirl of hygiene, give a silent nod to the engineers of the modern sewer system and to the poor 19th century clerk who fainted next to the Thames in July. They tried to cover the stench with lime. Bless their hearts. Now go to sleep, knowing your bathroom isn't an indoor swamp. And if it is, Please call someone immediately. Let's turn at last to the real experts in Victorian hygiene, women. Because of course, when society collapses under the weight of its own filth, who is expected to keep everything tidy? The women. Always the women. Let's begin with the obvious nightmare, Victorian fashion. Enormous skirts, towering petticoats, stiff corsets, lace, layers, ribbons, steel hoops, bustles, more lace, and perhaps one final emotional breakdown. Now imagine needing to use the bathroom. No, really. Imagine it. You're laced into a corset tight enough to compress your lungs into paperweights, with 5 or 6 layers of skirts ballooning around you, and someone's yelling about propriety in the hallway. And all you want is to relieve yourself without toppling over like a lace-covered oak tree. But the Victorians, to their credit, were nothing if not ingenious in their impracticality. The solution? Split-crotch drawers. Yes, that's the official term. It means exactly what it sounds like. Undergarments with an open seam between the legs, so that a woman could lift her skirt and handle business without removing a thing. Gravity and good aim took care of the rest. That's right, no zippers, no buttons, just a discreet gap in the fabric and the quiet prayer that no one walked in mid-process. Now you might ask, but where did they go? There were no women's bathrooms. Correct, there weren't. So most women, even aristocrats, relied on chamber pots, just like everyone else. Royalty or not, when nature called, you squatted over porcelain. Public events? Oh, that was fun. If you were at a ball or the opera, you might be lucky enough to slip away to a private retiring room where you'd perch over a pot surrounded by silk curtains and judgment. If not, you'd just hold it for hours, possibly days. Men had trousers and alleyways. Women had social expectations and bladder discipline. Now corsets, let's talk about them. Yes, they were tight. No, they weren't actually designed to break ribs. Well, not officially. But they did make bending difficult. So relieving yourself meant perfect posture, straight knees, and strategic maneuvering. In fact, it's likely Victorian women didn't even sit down fully while using the pot. They hovered, balanced, like acrobats of modesty. And when it came to menstruation, you know what's coming. No tampons, no packets, no packaging covered in flowers and lies, just rags, literally, strips of cloth, tucked carefully into the underlayers, washed, reused, and kept extremely private. These weren't discussed openly. There were no product reviews, no commercials, just secrecy, shame, and the hope that your period wouldn't come during a garden party. Some women made little belts to hold things in place. Some used cotton wadding. Many just improvised. And if there was a leak, you didn't speak of it. You simply went home early and died inside, because cleanliness was supposed to be feminine, dignified, invisible. Never mind the fact that you were wearing 40 pounds of fabric and sitting over a bucket. And all of this, all of it fell on women. They were expected to look spotless, smell sweet, keep the house clean, raise children, host tea, and somehow do it all without running water, reliable soap, or privacy. Men, meanwhile, could smell like pipe smoke and horse sweat and be praised for being robust. But a woman? One whiff of armpit and she was a cautionary tale. So they powdered, they perfumed. They carried little handkerchiefs spritzed with lavender to hold over their faces when the city stank. Not because they were delicate, but because they had no other choice. Even their hygiene tools were hidden. No one left a brush or sponge lying out. Everything was tucked away, out of sight, behind curtains, inside embroidered cases, because God forbid someone knew you had a body. So the next time you complain about a tiny bathroom stall or curse your leggings for not having pockets, remember, at least you're not hiking up 5 skirts and aiming over a chamber pot with split-crotch drawers and a corset pushing your liver into your throat. Now close your eyes, give thanks to elastic waistbands, whisper your appreciation for indoor plumbing, and dream of a world where menstruation doesn't involve a bucket and a prayer. You're safe. you're clean, you're horizontal. Go to sleep before your uterus gets any ideas. Let's talk about childhood. The tender, golden years. Only, not in Victorian England. Their childhood was a bit more feral. You might imagine a cute little Victorian child, in lace and curls, skipping through cobblestone streets with a flower in hand. No, that's a painting. Real Victorian children were more likely to be barefoot, snot-nosed, scratching their heads, and wondering whether the bath this month would come before or after another head lice outbreak. Hygiene and children had a complicated relationship, mostly because no one had time for it. If you were poor, and most children were, you were too busy working, coughing, or dodging tuberculosis to worry about clean fingernails. If you were middle class, your cleanliness depended on whether your parents believed in soap or divine punishment. Children, naturally, got the worst of it. They were small, sticky, constantly rolling in the dirt, and Victorian England didn't exactly invent the phrase, "let kids be kids." They were expected to behave like miniature adults, only smaller, smellier, and more expendable. Most children, especially boys, didn't wear shoes. Why bother? Streets were coated in everything from horse droppings to industrial soot. No matter what you stepped in, you were going to track it back into your overcrowded tenement anyway. A clean foot was a mythical beast. As for bathing, if you were lucky, your parents wiped your face and hands with a damp cloth before sending you off to school. Hair? Rarely washed. Maybe once a month. Or, if you were exceptionally cursed, shaved off altogether. Yes, head shaving. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was pest control. Lice were rampant. Every school, every street, every shared brush. A carnival of crawling bugs. And so, parents took clippers to scalp. It wasn't about shame. It was about survival. And maybe convenience. Because who has time to comb through hair when your fifth child just brought home a second-hand plague? And in case you're wondering how those noble institutions, the Victorian schools, tackled hygiene, they didn't, not really. Some enforced a weekly wash. Think cold water, a bar of soap, and zero mercy. Teachers would sometimes inspect hands and hair, which led to the great public shaming ritual known as the cleanliness check. Stand in a row, show your fingernails, get publicly humiliated. Childhood, where scurvy meets social anxiety. Occasionally, for more persistent grime, schools or orphanages might recommend the vinegar bath. Sounds luxurious, doesn't it? It wasn't. It stung. The vinegar was meant to cleanse and kill lice, but mostly it just burned and made you smell like a pickled radish. And then there was oatmeal. Yes, oatmeal. Not to eat, heaven forbid, but to rub on your skin. A sort of homegrown exfoliant. Mothers would mix oats with water and smear it on their children's rashes and sores. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it just made you look like a snack for pigeons. To be fair, some Victorian households did try. They boiled clothes. They insisted on daily face washing. They even taught kids to brush their teeth with chalk and ashes. But most of these efforts were inconsistent, expensive, or sabotaged by the fact that clean children were still playing in filthy streets, drinking bad water, and sleeping 4 to a bed. Add in poor nutrition, tight corsets, open fireplaces, and questionable medical advice, and you've got the perfect recipe for a childhood that was short, itchy, and underfed. But the worst part wasn't the filth. It was that no one expected better. Kids were supposed to be dirty. That was childhood. A little lice, a little ringworm, a little coal dust between the teeth. That was normal. You scraped your knee. You wiped it on your pants. You got a rash. Your grandmother rubbed goose fat on it. You got the sniffles. They sent you to bed with a spoonful of something that probably had opium in it. Sleep, tiny one. Sleep through the scabies. Even wealthier families didn't escape all this. Sure, they had access to nannies, bathtubs, and laundry help, but they also had a tendency to fear fresh air, mistrust water, and dress their children in enough wool to suffocate a grown man. Oh, and they too shaved their kids' heads, because lice do not recognize class. So if you're lying in bed now, Clean hair, soft sheets, not a lice comb in sight. Spare a sleepy thought for your Victorian counterpart. They might have been hunched over a wash tub, picking fleas off a sibling, or getting vinegar dumped on their skull. And remember, childhood may be messy, but at least you're not being scolded for your dirty knees while someone smears oats on your face and calls it skincare. Sleep well, little Victorian. May your lice be few and your soap mildly stingy. And now, sewers. No, don't get too excited. See if you've made it this far without mentally gagging. Congratulations. But hold your applause, because now we talk about the real star of Victorian hygiene, the part of history they politely forget in school books, the part where London nearly drowned in its own waste. Let's set the scene. Victorian cities were bursting at the seams, people flooding in from the countryside, factories spewing smoke, buildings crammed closer together than Victorian morals at a funeral. But with all that growth came an awkward, pressing question. Where does it all go? Not dreams, not ambitions. Waste, human waste, buckets of it, barrels, carts, slops, poo. And the answer for most of the 19th century was everywhere. In the early 1800s, the average Londoner's waste had 3 potential destinations: a backyard cesspit, charming little reservoirs dug beneath homes to collect filth. These were supposed to be sealed. They were not. Open drains in the street, which clogged, overflowed, and meandered like brown streams of despair. The River Thames, once a proud waterway, now a moving toilet for the entire city. The result? Leaking cesspools, oozing through floorboards, open-air gutters turned into rivers of sludge, and a smell so strong it was said to stop clocks and marriages. And as if that wasn't inspiring enough, Victorian industry decided to pitch in. Factories dumped their own charming contributions: dyes, acids, heavy metals, dead animals, all into the same rivers people drank from. You could walk along the Thames and identify professions by smell alone: tanners, acrid, butchers, rotting, soap makers, somehow worse. It was a perfect storm of human, industrial, and political waste. And what did the government do? They ignored it. For decades. After all, they didn't live near the stench. They had estates, curtains, money. What's a little cholera when you have a summer home in Kent? But cholera didn't care. And in 1831, it arrived, and kept arriving. Outbreak after outbreak swept the city. Thousands dead. Doctors baffled. People blamed miasma, or bad air, not the literal mountains of raw sewage next to their sandwiches. But finally, in 1858, the city had its breaking point. That fabled summer, the heat arrived, and the Thames boiled. Not literally, but it may as well have. The stench rose up like a biblical plague. Parliament was paralysed. Members couldn't speak. Curtains soaked in lime chloride were hung across windows in a desperate, perfumed surrender. And finally, the politicians snapped. Because if there's one thing that motivates Parliament, it isn't poverty, it isn't plague. It's the smell of human feces wafting through Westminster. So they called on a man named Joseph Bazalgette, an engineer with a plan, a backbone, and presumably no functioning sense of smell. He designed an underground sewer system, so vast and forward-thinking, it's still in use today. Miles of brick tunnels, massive pumping stations, a feat of engineering brilliance inspired not by compassion, but by collective nasal despair. Construction began. Tunnels were dug, and slowly, painfully, London stopped dumping waste into its drinking water. The cholera outbreaks declined. The river began to breathe again, and everyone clapped themselves on the back, pretending the solution had been scientific brilliance, not the fact that their eyebrows were melting off their faces. So if you've ever felt annoyed about paying taxes, just remember, some of that money goes toward keeping your home from smelling like an open toilet. And next time you flush a toilet or wash your hands, or walk down a street that doesn't reek of festering humanity, you can thank Joseph Bazalgette and the Great Stink and Parliament's sensitive little noses. London was drowning in poo, And it took the threat of nostril collapse to make anyone care. Roll over. Dream of clean pipes and modern plumbing. You're safe. You're downstream of history. And you're not wading through your neighbor's breakfast. Sleep well. So, we've bathed, we've brushed, we've squatted, we've suffered. And now, after centuries of filth and fervent denial, the Victorians finally discovered something that, in hindsight, feels wildly overdue. Germs, tiny invisible monsters, lurking in water, air, hands, mouths, intestines, under fingernails, inside surgical tools, everywhere. Yes, in the 19th century, humanity had its great oh no moment. The moment we collectively realized that all our tragic perfume, our boiling of underwear, our chamber pots and river dumping had done precisely nothing to protect us from the real enemy, microscopic things. Before this revelation, the prevailing belief was miasma theory, the idea that bad smells caused disease, not the sewage itself, not the bacteria, just the odor. In other words, if it reeked, it was dangerous. If it didn't, totally fine. Drink up. But as scientists, doctors and unfortunate corpses began to pile up with no logical pattern, a few oddballs started poking around under microscopes. They noticed something curious. People who washed their hands didn't die as much, and thus germ theory began its long, painful crawl into the mainstream. It wasn't fast, it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even widely accepted for decades. Because of course it's much easier to blame stench and sin than it is to admit that your favorite teacup might be crawling with invisible death. But a few names made a difference. Let's give them their moment. There was Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian doctor, who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, delivering babies with unwashed hands after dissecting corpses was a bad idea. He was ridiculed, laughed out of the room, and eventually committed to an asylum. Because nothing says thanks for saving lives like institutional punishment. Then came Louis Pasteur, who finally gave us the science behind germs, fermentation, spoilage, sickness, all caused by invisible organisms. He boiled things, he sterilized, he stared into petri dishes like a man possessed, and eventually people began to listen. Slowly, public health became a concept. Not just a hope, not just a sermon, a real structured effort to stop entire cities from collapsing under their own refuse. Governments started investing in clean water systems, proper waste disposal, and you'll love this, mandatory hand washing in hospitals. Revolutionary. Hospitals that once looked like haunted barns began to introduce gasp, soap, bed linens were changed, tools were sterilized. Some doctors even stopped operating in their street clothes. Progress. For everyday Victorians, this all filtered down in time, slowly, painfully, often after a few more funerals than necessary. But the message caught on. Cleanliness was no longer just social, it was medical, it was moral. Suddenly, washing your hands wasn't just about impressing the vicar, it was about surviving. Soap became a household staple, not just for the wealthy, but for the rising middle class. Public health posters appeared, encouraging proper toilet use, hand washing, and boiling drinking water. Some even had pictures, scary ones. And yes, it became performative. This was the Victorian era, after all. So naturally, hygiene got wrapped up in virtue and classism. People judged one another's habits. Cleanliness meant discipline. Dirtiness meant poor character. Morality was measured in the whiteness of your laundry. But underneath the snobbery, something important happened. People stopped dying quite so often. Cholera cases dropped. Infant mortality declined. Cities became slightly less lethal. Did they still make terrible choices? Yes. Did they still bathe in shared water and use toxic cleaning agents? Absolutely. But at least they'd begun to understand the real stakes. The war wasn't against stench, it was against bacteria. Too bad most of the people who needed that information were already dead. Yes, the rise of germ theory was a bit like closing the barn door after the plague cart had already rolled out. But progress rarely shows up on time. It arrives late, underfunded, and covered in soap scum. So if you're still awake, and I hope you're not, think about the miracle of your clean sheets, your flush toilet, your hands that don't smell like last week's stew. You live in a world where knowledge defeated superstition, where cleanliness isn't a luxury, it's a default, and you owe that to a few grumpy men with microscopes screaming into the void about invisible killers. Rather relatable, honestly. Now close your eyes. Don't think about germs, they're still there. Just pretend they're all wearing tiny bonnets and taking tea. Very polite, very sleepy. You're safe, you're clean, you're out of the 19th century. Sleep now. Eventually the tide turned. Not all at once. Don't get excited. This wasn't a glorious awakening where the entire British Empire suddenly scrubbed behind their ears and held hands around a clawfoot tub. But progress, like mildew, spread slowly. In the late 19th century, something miraculous happened. Soap got cheap. No more rendering fat in your backyard cauldron. No more lye that peeled off your fingerprints. By the 1880s, thanks to industrial advances and better distribution, soap became something even the lower classes could afford. Not always comfortably, but affordably enough to scrub your armpits once in a while without sacrificing dinner. Factories began churning out bars of soap in neat little boxes with names like Sunlight and Lifebuoy, suggesting a cleansing power that bordered on spiritual salvation. Marketing did its part too. Suddenly, to be clean was to be modern. Cleanliness meant decency, respectability, even patriotism, because nothing says moral superiority like aggressively perfumed hand soap. And right alongside the soap revolution came the plumbing revolution. Houses, even modest ones, began installing actual bathrooms, with drains, pipes, hot water that didn't require 20 buckets and a team of exhausted servants. No more chamber pots, mostly. No more leaning out the window with a slop bucket and a prayer. The Victorian home was being slowly reborn, pipe by pipe, into something vaguely resembling the modern bathroom. Taps, sinks, flushing toilets, bathtubs that weren't stored in the barn. And let's not forget hot water heaters, newfangled devices that could scald your skin faster than you could say indoor luxury. A marvel, a hazard, a status symbol. Which brings us to the great Victorian tradition of weaponizing hygiene. Because as always, the rich couldn't just enjoy their lavender-scented progress, they had to flaunt it. The upper classes began collecting bathrooms like others collected postage stamps. Entire rooms dedicated to marble tubs, imported towels, and water pressure strong enough to exfoliate your regrets. House guests were quietly judged by their bathing habits. Cleanliness wasn't just personal, it was performative. Meanwhile, the working poor were still boiling underwear in outdoor cauldrons, but now they were also being shamed for not looking or smelling like the gentry. Soap was affordable, yes, but time, privacy, and running water were not. Still, the expectation had been set. Clean, good, dirty, lazy. Never mind the context. This wasn't about germs anymore. This was about identity. You were supposed to look polished, smell faintly of lilac or bay rum, keep your children scrubbed, your lace unspotted, your privy deodorized with carbolic powder. Hygiene had gone from luxury to moral obligation. And naturally, it was women who bore the brunt of it. Because who else was going to make sure the laundry was white, the bathroom was scrubbed, and the children didn't smell like the alley? Progress, they called it. But hey, there were upsides. Life expectancy improved. Diseases dropped. The River Thames stopped bubbling like a cursed potion. And for the first time in history, a large percentage of the population had access to the sheer miracle of regular bathing. Not perfect, not universal, but better. Soap changed lives. Plumbing changed homes. And the ability to take a hot bath without summoning a team of servants changed the definition of being human. So yes, modernity smells better, but it also judges harder. And next time someone asks why you're still in your pajamas at noon and haven't brushed your hair, remember, there was a time when that was just called Tuesday. Now roll over, Close your eyes and inhale deeply through your remarkably clean nose. You're a product of the cleanliness revolution. Be proud, or don't. I'm too tired to care. Well, you made it. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you passed out somewhere between vinegar head baths and shared bathwater stew. In that case, congratulations. You fell asleep to the sound of chamber pots. What a legacy. If you are still awake, first of all, why? Secondly, I suppose I should wrap this up before I have to talk about tooth powder again. Let's take a moment, shall we? Be grateful. No, seriously. You can flush. You can wash your hair with something that wasn't made from pig fat and despair. You can apply deodorant without risking chemical burns or exploding armpits. You don't have to share bathwater with 6 family members and the ghost of Victorian shame. You live in a time where soap is scented, hot water comes out of a tap, and lice aren't part of the family photo. That alone makes you royalty by 19th century standards. So go ahead, sink into that mattress. Wiggle your toes under that clean blanket. Inhale deeply through your reasonably sanitary nostrils. No coal smoke, no chamber pot under the bed. Just you, your sleep, and the faint echo of historical horror. You've earned this rest. Sleep now. You've survived the filth. And if you're still awake, maybe go wash something. Your hands, your socks, your soul. Pick one. If for some strange reason you enjoyed this gentle walk through history's stinkiest decade, consider liking the video. Maybe subscribe, or don't. I'm not your Victorian housemaid. I'm just the exhausted voice dragging you through human hygiene, one rat-infested privy at a time. This has been the Grumpy Historian. Now please, sleep before I tell you what they did with false teeth. Good night.